So for our last lab, we'll be looking at human evolution and introduce ourselves to the idea of evolution by natural selection. So before we talk about what evolution is used for and how it really applies to us, we need to define it. Evolution simply is change in a population over time. So when we talk about evolution, we're not talking about an individual, we're talking about a group of individuals that are changing generation over generation. Unfortunately, it's not like Pokemon, right? In Pokemon, an individual would change and evolve, but in the real world, evolution refers to groups or populations changing over time. And the idea of evolution has been around for a lot longer than you'd think. In Darwin's time, evolution was not that strange of an idea. However, what Darwin revolutionized was the mechanism behind evolution, natural selection. So when we're talking about evolution and natural selection, it's important to note that while these terms are related, they don't mean the same thing. Evolution refers to change over time. Natural selection describes the process that allows that change to happen. So let's look at natural selection. In order for natural selection, this process of change, there are a few conditions that need to be met. The first condition is there needs to be variation. If everyone was exactly the same, there's no way to honestly select a certain group of individuals over another. It would just be random. So variation is required for natural selection to work. And when we say variation, what we mean is genetic variation, that the genes of individuals are slightly different from each other. They have different versions of those genes. And those different versions of genes, called alleles, lead to different traits and in turn, different phenotypes. So if we look at the picture here, we see all of these shells, and there's a variation in the color and stripe pattern that we see on those shells. This would be a group that has a lot of variation in it. Inheritance is our second condition. All of those different variations that we saw in the previous slide have to be genetically inherited. They have to be passed down from one generation to the next. Some variation can be caused by the environment, such as losing a limb or building up muscle, but those traits are not inherited, and so they're not going to be selected for in the next generation. For example, if I go and dye my hair, I naturally have brown hair. If I go and dye my hair purple, my children will not have purple hair. They'll have brown hair. So in order for natural selection to work through the generations, the traits that we're selecting for have to be selected for based on the traits that are actually being passed down to those next generations. And lastly, the last final condition of natural selection is differential reproduction or survival. This can be kind of summed up as competition. When you look at competition, no matter what, some individuals are going to outcompete others. Resources are limited. Food is limited. Mates are limited. Water might be limited. Shelter might be limited. So all of these resources that living things may use are limited. And that means that individuals have to compete to get a hold of those resources. This leads to the term survival of the fittest. Now, survival of the fittest is a little bit of a misnomer because it makes it sound like if you're bigger, faster, stronger, that you're going to do better. That's not quite what we mean. When we say survival of the fittest, all we mean is that those who have adaptations or traits that are best suited for the current conditions of the environment, those are the individuals who are going to do well. And when we say do well, we mean they're going to survive and reproduce more. Those who have the most offspring over the course of their lifetime are said to be the fittest, even if that means that they're smaller, weaker, or slower. So keep in mind that phrase, survival of the fittest, and what it really means when we're talking about natural selection. Individuals are competing. These individuals are diverse, and those with the traits that are best suited for the current conditions will have a better rate of survival and reproduction. One of our last things is also time. Now, this is a little bit of we'll put an asterisk with this one, because it goes with evolution that, again, we're not talking about an individual changing over time. We're talking about generations changing over time. Some other things to look at when we look at natural selection is adaptation. Now, adaptations are those characteristics that are inherited, that's an important note that they're inherited, that increase an organism's chance at surviving and reproducing. So this goes along with what we were talking about when we looked at competition, that those with adaptations better suited for the current conditions will be more fit and will have more offspring. And over time, natural selection will cause those adaptations to become more common in a population. So if we look down here, we see this population of rodents, and it's about 50-50, where some are white and some are gray on a gray background. If a predator comes along, the mice that are white are going to stand out pretty harshly against the gray background, whereas the gray mice, they blend in pretty easily. Our predator can easily see the white mice, they target them and eat them, and so over time, gray mice are more successful, they live longer, they have more babies, and so there are more gray mice over time. The population has shifted in favor of gray mice because they have the adaptation of camouflage. Here's another example. We have these birds here. They're eating beetles, and it turns out that they really, really, really like green beetles. They continue to eat those green beetles. The green beetles do not survive as long. They don't have as many offspring, and so these orangey brown beetles we see become more and more common since they are selected for, they're protected based on their color, and the green ones were selected against because they happened to be delicious to these birds. So if we kind of look at everything tying together, it's important to note that natural selection is, we're kind of simplifying the process, but we want to think of it in this larger framework. So overproduction, we mean that we will always overproduce, meaning that there's always going to be more organisms being created or being born, being made, than the environment can support. And that leads to a struggle for existence. Within that population, there are going to be variations, and some of those variations will be unfavorable, while some are favorable. Natural selection will help sort the unfavorable from the favorable variations. Those who have an unfavorable variation will not be able to survive as well or will not reproduce as well. And so those unfavorable variations will dwindle down and possibly disappear. Meanwhile, favorable variations allow for those individuals to compete better, they capture more resources, they have more offspring, and those offspring inherit those favorable variations themselves. Over time, the population will start to increase in the frequency of that favorable variation. And in some cases, that can actually lead to a new species being created. So if we look at evolution by natural selection, we recognize that it is a scientific theory, but we need to define what a scientific theory is. Casually speaking, when we're talking amongst our friends or family, we may use the word theory in a very inaccurate way. For example, if I say, my theory is that character Y will get killed off next week, if I'm talking about a TV show, that's more of like a hypothesis, where I'm making some sort of educated guess based on my findings alone from watching maybe the week before's episode. But that's not what a theory means in science. A scientific theory holds a lot more weight than an educated guess. A scientific theory is something that is strongly supported by lots and lots of evidence. It's generally accepted as an explanation for something happening in the natural world. Scientists take scientific theories very seriously. It's not a term that will just get thrown around And when we look at the evidence, we see that it's not just 1 or 2 studies. We're looking at years of studies, mountains of evidence, entire careers that have been built on finding this particular evidence. So a scientific theory, when we use it in biology, really holds a lot of weight, especially compared to how people use it when speaking casually. So what is the evidence that we have out there for evolution? We have fossils, which are the remains of ancient organisms. We can look at the biogeography, artificial selection, vestigial organs or structures, similarities between different organisms called comparative anatomy, and genetic evidence. It's important to note genetic evidence was not available in Darwin's time, but we do have access to that now, so we're still going to talk about it. Let's look at artificial selection, since we don't have enough time to go through all of these. Artificial selection is very similar to natural selection with one major caveat. Instead of the natural environment driving that change, humans are the drivers of change in this case. We choose who is the best fit in this case. So if we look at a wild mustard plant, and if we look at how humans have impacted the wild mustard plant through selective breeding and agriculture, we see that from this one single wild plant, and based on what we wanted from this plant, we have created cauliflower, broccoli, cabbage, kale, and kohlrabi. All of these vegetables that you have probably had at some point in your life, and you may have in your fridge right now, all descended from one single wild plant. And it was through generations and generations of selectively breeding this wild plant that it gave us all of these vegetables that we have for dinner. We also look at selective breeding or artificial selection when we look at dogs. So at one point there was some sort of ancient canine, some sort of wolf-like organism that humans were drawn to for some reason, whether it be protection or companionship, doesn't quite matter. We then decided to choose the individuals who would mate and breed together. And then from those offspring, we selected those who had the traits we liked the most and had them breed. And we did the same thing for generations over generations until we see the wide variety of dogs that we have in our homes as our pets. Something like a Chihuahua would have not happened naturally. That is most definitely something that happened because we stepped in and selectively bred these animals until we got to that point. However, when humans interfere, we don't always get everything right, and sometimes there's unintended consequences from artificially selecting organisms. Some of those problems include pesticide resistance and antibiotic resistance. Pesticide resistance is an issue when we look at agriculture, where the pests, the insects and whatnot that were normally problematic for all of our plants, we killed most of them off using pesticides, but there were a few who could withstand the pesticides. They could still survive. When we killed off all of the other pests and left behind only the resistant individuals, the resistant individuals bred like wildfire. They no longer had the competition of the other non-resistant bugs. And so now if you spray pesticides on those plants, it doesn't really do as much. We've burned out the use of that pesticide with that particular insect. With antibiotic resistance, bacteria that normally would be killed off by antibiotics that we would take from a doctor can thrive even if they're living in your body when you take that medication. This is a very big problem. We're seeing different organisms like MRSA, methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus. We're seeing drug-resistant gonorrhea. many different bacterial infections are at risk of becoming uncontrollable because of antibiotic resistance. Again, let's look a little bit deeper at pesticide resistance. So you can spray down your field, but again, if your pesticide did not kill all of the individuals, because there's a variation in how they respond to that chemical, those who survived will reproduce. And the traits that they have that allowed them to survive will probably be passed down. So the pesticide becomes less and less effective for every single round that you use it. So if we look at the photo here, we have this individual who has some sort of genetic variation that allows it to survive even if it's sprayed with a pesticide. He survives after getting sprayed. He has offspring. Those offspring have offspring. And now the population has shifted to the majority having this specialized survival gene. With antibiotic resistance, there's non-resistant bacteria. They replicate. And at some point, someone develops a mutation in their DNA that allows them to survive even if they're in an environment with antibiotics. If we use those drugs, only the resistant ones will survive. They can thrive and multiply. And now our population has shifted from generally non-resistant to resistant. So what causes the genetic variation that we see? The real root of all change and variation we see is mutation. A mutation is a change in the DNA sequence. And when we have that change, that can cause a new trait to show up. Sexual reproduction allows us to create new combinations of these traits in gametes. This is one of the reasons why you don't look identical to your parents or your siblings. Every single time a new individual is created, those genes and traits get reshuffled into a new combination that may not have been seen before. Some other mechanisms include gene flow, genetic drift, and sexual selection. Gene flow just talks about the movement of alleles between populations. So when individuals immigrate or emigrate to a new area, that is gene flow. If I were to move across the country, I'm not just moving myself, I'm also moving my genes. So if I were to move there, settle down, and have children with someone from that area, then I would have taken my genes from the West Coast and moved them to the East Coast and blended the two coasts together. This keeps the populations that are in close proximity to each other very similar. There's really not much difference between one population and the next if individuals are constantly moving back and forth between them. Genetic drift is a change due to chance. This causes a loss in genetic diversity and variation, and is really problematic if a population is very small. Something that could cause genetic drift could be something like a flood or a fire, some sort of event that drastically reduces the population size. Sexual selection is the last one. Sexual selection occurs when certain traits are more attractive to a mate. If someone is considered unattractive, then they probably won't find a mate and have very many offspring. But if someone has those traits that a mate would find very attractive, regardless of whether or not that trait is actually helpful, that individual will have many more offspring. And there's different types of traits that can lead to sexual selection. It could be a dance, it could be a song, it could be something very showy. For example, a peacock. A male peacock has very large, vibrantly colored feathers, and he uses those feathers to attract a peahen, the female peacock. If a male has very large, showy flowers with lots of eye spots, he will be more successful than a male who has very drab feathers and very few of those eye spots. If someone does not mate it means that they're not going to pass their genes on either. So if someone does not mate, it actually, when it comes to natural selection, it doesn't matter how long that individual lives because the genes were never actually passed on. So where do we come in with this? When we look at the evolutionary tree, we're looking at a representation of how these organisms are grouped together and how they're tied in together throughout history. If we look at primates, primates share a common ancestor. And a common ancestor is simply some ancestor from the past that eventually had branched off to create all of the descendants we see down the line. The lineage is the line of descent. We can trace the lineage back. So for this lemur here, we can trace it back to this common ancestor. If we look over here, we can trace humans and chimpanzees to its common ancestor right here, where we join together to a smaller branch. So when we're looking at these lineages on this kind of family tree, so to speak, this evolutionary tree, when we first split from that common ancestor, we're actually going to be very, very similar to each other. But the longer that time passes, the more time that's allowed to go by, the more small little changes accumulate. And as those changes accumulate, those differences become larger and larger and larger between the two groups. That's how we end up with humans and chimpanzees. While a lot of similarities are across between the two of them, we're distinctly different. There's different RNA sequences, there's different proteins that we see in the humans and chimpanzees because enough time has been allowed to go by that we've accumulated all of those small changes. And now, since we've accumulated so many small changes, we see much, much larger changes on the exterior. When we look at the first hominins, which means we're looking at the first human-like organisms, there's some interesting, unique anatomical features that we see across them. One of the big ones is being bipedal, meaning we're standing up and walking around on 2 feet. This is a very large, very important and unique feature of hominins. The shape of the face and the brain size. We have a flatter face, we have a more pronounced chin, and our brain is much larger than our chimpanzee cousins. We also have changes in our teeth. We don't have the sharp canines that an ape would have. So how far back can we go when we're looking at humans and hominins? In order to be considered part of the genus Homo, which is where we would fall, Homo sapiens, in order to fall in the genus Homo, fossils have to meet the following criteria. The brain size has to be 600 cc's or greater. The jaw and teeth must resemble those of more modern humans, and we have to find evidence of tool use. So if we look down the line here, we see Homo sapiens, which would be us, and if we look at the skull, it looks like a modern day human skull. But it also includes Homo habilis, which, while looking a little bit differently, you can see some of the similarities. The jaw looks similar, the eye sockets look kind of similar, and while the brain case is a little bit smaller, it still meets the criteria of 600 cc's or more. If we go back further though, to Australopithecus or Ardipithecus, we start to become more and more ape-like and less human-like. We see that the brain cavity has gotten even smaller and the jaw is significantly different, as well as the face shape has changed as well. So if we look down the line of how long ago this really took, we see Homo sapiens is relatively new. Here's our x-axis down here in millions of years ago. So this 0 would be present day, 0.5 would be 500,000 years ago, 1,000,000 years ago, so on and so forth. So Homo sapiens are relatively new. Homo neanderthalensis, our next closest cousin, Homo heidelbergensis, Homo erectus, Homo ergaster, Homo habilis, all of these meet those criteria in terms of like the brain size and the face shape and the tool. As we go further back, we see Australopithecus and Ardipithecus, even further back. And again, when we look at the skulls here, we see how they've changed over time, getting closer and closer to this human, very, very human skull we see here. So what do you need to do for lab this week? There's a video that you'll be watching called Your Inner Monkey. It's about an hour long, and while you're watching that video, you'll want to answer the questions from your lab manual. After you've done that, submit your lab report online, and you have finished the lab of Biology 5, Human Biology.